Hey guys, it's John from That DIY Couple. I am an Ivy League educated attorney and real estate investor. On this channel we talk about how to fulfill your maximum potential and how to make the world a better place. Today I'm talking about how to structure real estate investments with outside investors. So I did a video a couple weeks ago about how I invest in real estate. It's a video where I bought a house for $0 essentially. And in that video, some people asked questions of me, which is how do I structure deals with investors? Because I mentioned in that video that I had other investors in that deal that helped me to kind of maximize the potential of that. So in this video, I'm going to talk about how I do that and how you can do that as well. So the first thing to understand about working with other investors when you're investing in real estate is that there are many different ways to structure real estate investments. In general, you're structuring things as what people call a joint venture or a JV. So you're one member of the joint venture and your other investors are the other members of the joint venture. Those investors could be active investors, as in they could be experienced real estate investors that are contributing their own experience, or they might be completely passive investors that are just contributing money. In almost every experience that I've had in real estate investing, the other investors have been passive investors and I've been the active investor. And we'll get into why that could be important and the pros and cons of that in a little bit later in this video. But the legal structure that you use to put these investors together is a business, like a business entity. And the way that I do it is structuring an LLC. An LLC is different than a corporation. It's essentially a partnership that has limited liability. It's called a limited liability company. You can form one in every state in the US. Every state has their own particular rules and laws about it, but the great benefit of an LLC is that you can buy the property in the name of the LLC, and then the LLC itself can be owned by multiple people. So like I said before, you could have an LLC with yourself, 5 people, 10 people, whatever it is. Owning the property directly in your name and not in an LLC has a bunch of different disadvantages. The first big disadvantage is that it's really hard to move people in and out of the property. Every time somebody leaves the business venture, the deed itself has to be changed, which is a big legal process. If someone were to die or whatever during the course of your business venture, that can be very complex depending on the legal structure, the way that the deed title to the property is structured. There's no anonymity, as in like your names will be publicly on the property records forever, which can be a big issue that we'll get into. And again, there's very little flexibility in structuring relative ownership percentages. So like the ownership of the property, if you're buying it not through an LLC or a company, is set at the beginning, and changing that can be very complex. Buying an LLC, essentially on the property records, the property is owned by whatever, 123 Main Street LLC, like the address of the property. And then in the operating agreement for the LLC, which is kind of like the bylaws, the constitution, whatever you want to call it of the LLC, like the document that governs the relationships between all the people in the LLC, you have almost unlimited flexibility to figure out how you want to structure that. So for example, if you're an investor, if you're the sponsor, kind of the person putting the deal together, you could say, I want to take a larger percentage of the LLC relative to my capital contribution than somebody else. So say the property costs $100,000, I put in $50,000, but I'm the person that found the property, put everything together. Maybe that means that I get 60% of the LLC instead of 50%. And my partners that come in get 40%, even though they're also putting in $50,000, for example. There are many more things that you can do with an LLC than that. You could have different distribution levels, right? So you can say, like, even though we contribute the same amount of money and own the same percentage of the LLC, when we sell the property, I get a higher percentage of that, for example. Or if one person dies, maybe I get their shares or their interest or whatever else. Big benefit of the structure is that it's anonymous. So on the property records, all you see is the name of the LLC. You don't see the people that own the LLC. And in most states, you can't search who owns the LLC. That's not public information. That's great because if you're buying property and you're worried about liability, somebody could just conveniently slip and fall in front of your property, for example. If they know that, maybe they see your name, they know that you're rich or you live in a nice house somewhere else or whatever else, that's a big issue. Obviously you have property insurance, but it's another layer of protection. And then a limited liability company, the definition is in kind of the function, which is that your liability as an individual is limited. So if the business itself does something bad, something that incurs liability for the company or the property, You yourself are insulated from that generally, unless you have done something really, really bad yourself or not followed the appropriate corporate formalities. So structuring stuff in an LLC is great for both of those reasons. You get the same advantages with a C corporation or an S corporation, but an LLC is a lot simpler, and compared to a C corporation, the taxation of an LLC is a lot better. I can go into a different video if there's interest about LLCs versus C corporations and all of that. But in general, the structure that you want to do is an LLC. So in my own investing, I've structured these LLCs kind of in every way. As I alluded to before, you have a lot of flexibility in how to structure an LLC. The very first deals that I did are what I described just before. I would put in maybe, say, 20 or 30% of the total dollar amount that I was contributing, but I would get an outsized portion of the equity of the ownership of the LLC because I was the person putting the deal together. I was the manager, the general partner, whatever you want to call it. And that was very simplistic, but seemed to work okay because I felt like I was getting rewarded, at least on the back end, for all of the work that I was doing at the beginning to set it up. That was maybe deal number 1, deal number 2, deal number 3. I did something kind of like that. By deal number 4, I realized that that probably was not the most fair structure. And also I realized that I probably didn't want to keep putting in a ton of money because I was doing a lot of ongoing work with these properties without being compensated. So originally in the first few deals, I was the property manager. So like the person actually managing the property, finding the tenants, placing the tenants, like kind of doing everything surrounding the tenants, but I wasn't even paying myself a property management fee because I assumed that was kind of part of the deal with the LLC, even though we never talked about it. But by the third or fourth property, I thought this is really unfair because we could own these properties for years or decades, and a normal property management fee is like 6%, 8%, 10%, something like that, maybe even more if I'm doing like short-term rental stuff, which I was at the time. I really need to make sure that I'm being compensated for that type of work. So by the fourth deal or something, I started to structure my LLCs where I would put in some money. I would still get an outsized percentage of the LLC. So I'd put in maybe 10% of the money, I'd get 20% of the ownership, but I would also get fees. So I would get a property management fee, which was like at 8% or 10%, depending on the property, every month. I would get something akin to a finance fee or a refinance fee. So every time the property got financed or refinanced, I get a percentage of that, like 1%, 2%. And I would also get like an acquisition fee or a disposition fee, like 1%, 2%. Again, that's the fee that I took for putting the deal together. And there are other fees as well that are appropriate to charge as well in the real estate space, but these are just the fees that I took initially. And that's more or less the structure that I did for deal number 4, deal number 5, deal number 6, something like that. By deal number 7, I really didn't want to keep putting in my own money because I had by that point been pretty extensively invested in real estate. Like I had a lot of properties, some that I owned myself, others in these JV structures. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if I could get some equity in these projects, but I didn't have to be a direct equity investor. So I started to structure things that were a little bit more exotic, again, through the LLC structure. So I'll give one good example about a structure that I've used many times and continue to use. It's basically treating equity like debt. So here's how it works, and this is how I did it with that house where I bought for $0. I found some investors that wanted to invest in real estate, and they were okay making essentially a fixed return on their investment. Let's call it 10% because that's the number that I used a lot. So I said to them, you're going to invest in real estate. Your investment is going to be being a part owner in the LLC that owns the property, but I'm going to have the option to buy you out of the LLC to force you to sell me your equity at a set return. So say you invested $100,000 in the property, I have the option to buy you out of your $100,000 investment by paying you after a year, for example, $110,000, right? A 10% return in a year, 10% annualized amount. The advantage of that structure is that it's equity and that they actually own the LLC, part of the LLC, but it's also kind of like debt because they're accruing an interest on that debt. And at my option, I can pay them out, right? That's what you can do with like a mortgage traditionally, is that if you have a $100,000 mortgage and you have a 4% interest rate, you can pay that off whenever you want for most mortgages without any penalty. It's at your option. For an investor, they have the advantage of Well, if I don't pay them off, they own the real estate. So they own the LLC that owns the real estate. So they have the security of the real estate, or they have the guarantee that if I do pay them off, they're at least going to make 10% of their money. And I told everybody that most likely I'll be paying them off because that's my goal. And what I did is I had a small sliver of the LLC. So I own maybe like 10% of the LLC, 5% of the LLC or something for putting the deal together. And maybe I put in a little bit, like $1,000, $5,000, something like that to structure it. The partners, the investors, put in all the rest of the money. And the way that I got liquidity, the way that I got the cash to pay them off, was that I appreciated the property. The property increased in value. So going back to the video that I made about buying a property for $0, the way that I was able to do that was I bought the property for really low. I invested some money into it, and then the property appraised at such an amount that not only was the initial purchase price plus the renovation costs, like not only did the value exceed that, but it exceeded it by so much that I was able to pay off my investors with an interest rate. So to use specific numbers, I think in that project, I raised something like $120,000, and I got something like $140,000 back from my refinancing. So I used the $120,000 to repay the investors, and then I also paid them an interest rate, that 10% fixed interest rate, to buy out their property. So at the end of the day, I owned the property 100% free and clear with the mortgage, but I'd used their money kind of like debt, kind of like an exotic form of debt, like a bridge financing at 10%, because I'd cashed them out of their equity position at my option. I've done that on the flip side too, where I've had properties where I have used the same structure, but I haven't actually cashed out the investors entirely. I have another project that is similar numbers, but the refinance wasn't quite enough to pay back the investors 100% of their initial investment amount. Maybe they got paid back like 70 or 80%. So I said to them again, I'll pay you 70 or 80% back of your investment at an interest rate, and then you'll keep the remaining 20% in the property. So in this case, I said, whatever that remaining 20% is relative to the appraised value is your equity in the property. So say they gave me $100,000, I paid back like $88,000 because that's 80 grand plus say about 10% interest. They had $12,000 left of equity in the property, but now the property is worth $200,000. So their equity percentage, their ownership of the property is $12,000 divided by $200,000. So not very much, but at least they still have equity remaining in the property. And I still have the option to cash them out at some point later at the interest rate. So if in a year or in 2 years I'm making money, I don't want to take that to me, I want to cash them out, whatever, I can use that to exit them from the property. That I think is a really cool, interesting structure that I haven't seen a ton of investors use. But again, it's the flexibility LLC, the JV structure, where you can do all sorts of exotic things with equity and debt. The idea of using the LLC is kind of leveled up one level when you get into the world of funds. Private equity is what I'm talking about, and I do run a private fund. That's something that I have learned about how to do in the course of my real estate investing. I think it's a little bit beyond the scope of this video to talk about exactly what that is. In any case, it's the same concept of what I'm talking about with these JVs, just kind of blown up on a larger scale, pooling a lot more investors together, doing a little bit more institutionalized, a little bit more formalized, having a lot of talk about those fees and whatever else kind of before you go into it. So some of the disadvantages about structuring things in a JV LLC structure are, A, you might have a lot of different investors, some of whom might want to be more or less active than you would want. So I think that can be a problem. If you're an investor, real estate investor, you probably want to be an active real estate investor, right? You want to be the person kind of driving the boat, making the decisions. At least that's how I invest in real estate. It's okay if you want to be a passive real estate investor, but when you are an active real estate investor and you get another person who's an active real estate investor on as your investor, that can be complicated. It's like too many cooks in the kitchen, right? Like too many different voices kind of going on. And I've had experiences like that before in my real estate career where it makes it very awkward and strange to have to intermesh with people like that. So that's a disadvantage. Picking your investors wisely can be a challenge. B, a big disadvantage is that you have to raise money for every single deal, right? So every time you are buying a property, you have to kind of reform these legal structures. You have to form an LLC for every single property. You have to figure out the relative fees, equity, structure, interest rates, if you're doing what I just said. All that sort of stuff has to be negotiated every single time, and it might depend on the property. Some investors might like structuring something in one way, some investors like a different way, whatever else. It can be awkward to have that conversation because, again, you're talking about your compensation, how much you should be rewarded. People might disagree. For me, raising money is always a stressful, hectic event. It usually happens right before or right after I've gone under contract for a property. Under contract meaning that I've signed the agreement but I haven't yet closed in the property, right? I have maybe 30, 45, 60 days between signing the contract and closing to put the deal together. If I identify a property but don't go under contract and then have to raise money, the big disadvantage is that I might lose the property, as in somebody else might buy it because it takes me too long to get the investors together to buy the property. Or if I go under contract, I have to put a deposit down, and if I don't end up buying the property, that deposit can go away. I can lose all that deposit. So there's a mad rush kind of between going under contract and buying the property to find the investors. That can really suck. And the last major disadvantage is that it could be hard to get a mortgage using an LLC. So this is like a big one that I talk about with people all the time. Very frequently lenders, conforming lenders like Fannie Mae conforming lenders will not loan to an LLC for a residential property. They might for commercial properties, but buying like a single family home or a two family home, it's gonna be a residential loan, or you'd like to get a residential loan, but a bank won't lend to the LLC. Now, there are some banks that will do that. There are banks in New Jersey that have done that for me. And I'm sure there are banks in every state that do that, but it can be more complex. You'll end up PGing the loan anyways, right? Personally guaranteeing, as in you're signing the mortgage, you're signing the note, you're putting your credit on the line, even if the loan is in the name of the LLC. Some ways around this are that you could buy the property in your own name and then transfer it to the LLC. That's a little bit awkward. Some risk involved with the due on sale clause. We can get into that in a different video, but some risk involved in that. And also it eliminates the anonymity part because then your name is on the property records. But again, there are ways around that and to figure it out. Some of these disadvantages are addressed through the fund structure that I described, but some of them are intrinsic in the nature of investing in real estate. But however you do it, however you structure stuff, using an LLC, buying stuff in that format, a JV format is the way to do it, absolutely 100%. If you guys have more questions about some of the details that I've just talked about in real estate investing, the way that I've structured deals, how you could structure deals, finding investors, private equity, all of that, I'd love to hear from you. Please leave a comment down below. And until next time, do good and always make things better. Thanks very much.